Thank you, everyone, for coming today. It looks like a few more people are coming in, so we're really glad to have such a great turnout this afternoon. I'm Danielle Knapp. I'm the McCosh curator at the museum, and I had the pleasure of working with these two gentlemen over the last year, and even longer, I think. Richard Spear, the guest curator for the exhibition, Journey to the Third Dimension, and Tom Kramer, Portland-based artist. And it's been such a wonderful experience working with you both and seeing you realize this project. Richard had first come to the museum to pitch an idea for an exhibition that would look at the parallel practice of drawing and painting that Tom has been embarking on through his career, and met with me and our then director, Jill Hartz, and we were really excited about what you had laid out as a possibility of showing an exhibition here. Also our opportunity to share Tom's work with our student audience at the university. We know he's very well established and well represented throughout Portland and has shown throughout the state and beyond, but for so many of our visitors, if they're university students, this is their first opportunity to encounter his work, and that's been really, really special. The project's been made possible by funding from the Hartz Fund for Contemporary Art and additional generous funding from a Ford Family Foundation grant, as well as support from Ogden Gallery, which represents Tom's work in Portland. And we're so grateful to Tom for making so many works available from his studio collection for the show, but also for special loans from the collections of Jordan Schnitzer, Ed and Amy Gruba, and Betsy Kramer. So if you haven't yet had the opportunity to enjoy the exhibition, I hope you'll spend some time in the space after you've learned so much from Richard and Tom's conversation. Another special opportunity for you today is a book signing that will follow their Q&A. So if you haven't already purchased a book, we have them available in our store, and you can get them personally signed, which we really appreciate you making the time to do that for us. And we also, they generously gave their time to sign copies in the store. So if you don't have time to hang around for a personalized copy, you can still get set up with an autographed copy if you meet with our visitor services staff. Richard Spear, very accomplished writer, curator, critic, a really wonderful voice in telling us new ways of thinking about how we're looking at art in Oregon and beyond, a forthcoming publication on Sam Francis in Japan, so a lot of really exciting projects. We're so glad that you realized the project with Tom's work here, and we're looking forward to hearing what else you have to say to us about this today. And after they speak, I will walk around with this mic if we want to take questions from the audience, so that'll be further into our presentation, but I'll go ahead and let you both get started, and thanks again so much.
Thank you, Danielle. And thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Yes, thank you.
I appreciate that. Do you hear me all right? Okay. And thank you to the entire staff of the museum. This has been a pleasure from start to finish. It's a dream for a curator. And I've been following Tom's work since 2002, when I began as art critic at Willamette Week. And I have written about Tom for Art News and The Oregonian and Visual Art Source and other publications. And so it has been a great journey for me of now almost 20 years getting to know your work better. In 2015, Tom's longtime partner, photographer Shannon Kraft, passed away. And in the aftermath of her death, Tom went through a lot of his possessions and did a lot of sorting and sort of cleansing in a way. And he found in his attic a cache of drawings that he had forgotten that he had. And so Tom invited Bonnie Lang Malcolmson and myself and a handful of other curators to come and look at these drawings. And when I saw them, I just was blown away, because they stretched back to 1974, which was about the advent of your beginning to draw. And I just thought, wow, what an epiphany to see the drawings knowing your paintings the way that I and so many other people do. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to counterpose the drawings and the paintings and let people see the links between them. And so I'm so thrilled that we've had the opportunity to do that in this show. And I think it looks great. Everybody in the museum just went the extra mile to make it look as beautiful as it does. So I'm very grateful for that. And Tom is, I got to tell you, he's, how do you talk about Tom Kramer? I mean, he is a kind of a legend in the Northwest, with work stretching back into the 1980s, some of it public artwork that has just become part of the very fabric of our cities, in particular Portland. And Tom is also one of the few artists that I can say that his personality and intellect are every bit as fascinating as his artwork, as I think you will soon discover if you didn't already know. So Tom Kramer, thank you so much for your art.
Well, thank you so
show.
much, Richard, and thank you. I'll second everything you said, and thank you all for being here. I greatly appreciate that, and hopefully it'll be worth your time, and hopefully Richard will help guide it along and well, you know. But thank you so much, and I will say that this building has always been one of my favorite buildings, not only in the state of Oregon, but actually in the entire world. I think it's a gorgeous, beautiful building. And there's only two other buildings in the state that rival it, in my opinion. One would be Timberline Lodge, and the other would be the library in Mount Angel. It's you know, like a UNESCO World Heritage Site, as far as I'm concerned. It deserves that status. So it's a privilege to be showing in such an incredibly great museum. This museum is along with the Halley Ford, is really one of my two favorites in the state.
Yeah, I agree.
And being very innovative about their programming, you know.
Definitely. You know, your work, I have always just been so enchanted by the visual rhythm of your work. And my first love is music. I was a pianist, opera singer for a while before I got into writing. So I very much see artwork as visual rhythms and harmonies. So that's one reason I'm so struck by your work, and I know you have a background in music as well. I wonder if you could tell our audience a little bit about the musical connection to your artwork.
Yes, well, it's a great question. It's sort of ground zero for my MO about everything, and that is, I did indeed come from a musical family, and one of my sisters is here, if you want to wave to everybody, came up from San Francisco. She studied cello, and my other sister is a professional violinist up in Vancouver, BC, and my other sister plays the violin too, so I played the French horn, and I grew up in a background, a very heavy musical background. My mother was definitely she was a church organist, so, you know, part of my brain patterning from an early age was music was on all the time, the classical composers, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, etc. So I have a really strong foundation in classical music, and the idea of synesthesia has always been something to me that's just normal and natural and not weird at all, which means, for example, if you see a Monet painting, I can, or you, I'm sure, all out there can sort of hear Debussy's music. They're both impressionists. One happens to be a visual manifestation, but the other would be a visual manifestation. So I'm really interested in my art in translating musical ideas into visual ideas. And I'm also interested in listening to music and thinking of, thinking of what would be the appropriate visual outcome of that. And also it goes the other way. When you look at the Jackson Pollock, you know, I at least could definitely square that with Charlie Parker or Miles Davis or bebop. It has a direct connection to the music of that era. Frank Stella, I kind of think of Magical Mystery Tour, the Beatles, or kind of Pepperland or Carnaby Street. So there's one thing I did teach for a long time. So one thing that I always taught my students was that whatever you can study art through music or study music through art. For every kind of visual art, there's a musical counterpart. You know?
Well, and you are not only knowledgeable about classical music and a great fan of Wagner and Bruckner and other composers from the classical romantic idioms, but you also have a great appreciation of the Doors, of the electronic music of Klaus Schulze. You're very eclectic, and in fact, you know, I find you eclectic across the gamut. And it seems that a lot of your art is about uniting things that are extremes. You know, a pop art sensibility with a fine art sensibility. The so-called, you know, populism with elitism. The dark and light. I mean, it seems you're really preoccupied with dialectical oppositions and bringing those together. Am I right about that?
You're very correct about that. In fact, I kind of like the idea of my psychiatrist is in the office, so full whatever. I have my he's back there, Dr. Jules Altfast, so I might as well admit it, that I've had professional help. But anyway, but one of the things I learned out of that experience is that you don't have to have any one emotion. Language tends to compartmentalize emotions. You can have a symphonic bag full of emotions, you know, happiness, sadness at the same time. And I think a lot of people really respond, for example, to the Beatles music, because their songs often have a more than one emotion going on at the same time, you know. Yeah. Sort of euphoria at the same time, kind of a melancholia, let's say. And I'm really attracted to music that has more than one emotion. I mean, Bach to me is beautiful, exalted Enlightenment era music, but it also has I think Glenn Gould said it's like staring at the stars at night. You know, it also has a cosmic and a mathematical aspect, an emotional and a rational explanation. Yeah. And I'm really interested in that. You're right, yeah.
I agree with you completely. You know, I think a lot of people may look at your gilded relief paintings and see just this blazing, gleaming gold, and it's like, you know, Louis XIV, the Sun King, you know, and people may assume that this artwork is all about, you know, brightness and light and exultation. But in fact, you know, as we were talking, as I was interviewing you for the catalog essay, there is actually a lot of what we would call darkness in the work as well. I mean, can you speak to that?
Sure, yeah. I wanted to speak to that because there's no high without low, there's no low without high, there's no right without left, there's no south without north. Therefore, you can't really have a so-called exalted experience without knowing what a low experience is like. I think my enemy, I guess, would be blandness. I don't like anything that's doesn't take a stand of some kind or doesn't go out there and stick its neck out somehow visually. And I am really attracted to not the dark side in the way most people think about it, but the dark side as something appealing. I've read, you know, Nietzsche and Aleister Crowley and Jim Morrison of the Doors, who was, you know, extremely intelligent. Once you eliminate the writing about him, the lyrics are very intelligent, yeah. And the Beatles are highly intelligent and highly developed. I don't discriminate about what it is. I more am interested in what I can get out of it, yeah. If that makes sense. In other words, we've talked about this a lot. To me, who writes the book is much more important than what the book's about, is my point, I think.
Well, and I think so many people are familiar with those gilded works and in the starburst patterns, but yet for every one of those you also do what I think of as a swampy kind of marshland, very aquatic, very sort of squishy plants and like a bayou or a swamp where alligators may lurk, or, you know, there's danger there, there's sexuality, there's the unseen, and so to me that is one of the areas of your work that speaks to mystery and to withholding and to maybe awe and fear of what might be in that very visceral, sensual realm.
Yes, well, there's a piece in this show that's one of my absolute favorites. It's called Fantastic Planet, and that must be the one you might be referring to. That's
Fantastic Landscape.
Sorry, yeah. It's, God, I should
Good Planet, too.
But it definitely has, some of, I think, my most successful works, like that one, is where I go off track, where I get so involved in the work, I completely forget what I'm doing or where I am or who I am, and just get completely immersed in it. And because normally I don't work in that kind of palette, you know. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to bring up another thing very quickly, is that a lot of times, that's a classic example, I do the piece, I just start working, and then the idea or what the piece is about happens afterwards, if that makes any sense at all. Edvard Munch actually said an amazing quote that really registers with me, which is, I paint what I saw, not what I see. And I think that's very accurate for me, that I sort of gestate things through experience, and then the exceptions to that, the two exceptions are in this show, which are really unusual. Moon Lake and Politics of Experience were deliberately done in honor of, in one case, a place, and the other, a book.
Moon Lake is the, if I'm right, is the big circular piece
Yes.
that undulates the surface as people walk into the
Yes.
foyer. And then Politics of Experience is on the opposite wall.
That's correct.
So what was the place and who was the person that
Thank
it
you.
was inspired by?
It's in the catalog, very well put by you, but it's in the. Sorry.
Oh yes, I recall.
I got my little shot. But anyway, The Politics of Experience is a famous book by R.D. Laing written in 1967, and I started reading the book probably 25 years ago, and it completely blew my mind out. I mean, I thought, this guy understands me as if he's writing it to me personally. He's just an absolutely off-the-chart, brilliant writer and thinker. So I said, I got to do something about this. So I did. And
Did you go in and say, I want to take R.D. Laing's thinking and put it in a kind of a visual portrait of that body of knowledge?
Yes, and I think it's interesting that your selection of the drawing, it was fascinating to me that Richard found a drawing from like 1996 or 8 or something, but that drawing was in fact the basis, the skeleton for what later became The Politics of Experience. And I think what it has to do with, maybe a little bit, this might be pushing it, but the outside of the composition was done with a chisel, and it has a more immediate, incisive, direct, aggressive, like the way life is on the outside world. It's sort of often a struggle and a battle, and other people, you don't know what they're thinking and all that. And he said what drives people insane is what others may be thinking about you. I mean, he said stuff like that, which I sort of agree with that. But the internal part is much more euphoric and soft and curvilinear. And that sort of represents the inner world, which is, I think, much more interesting. I think a lot of people have a lot of problems because they're overly concerned about how they may, the pressure of conforming, for example, the pressure of being liked, And I'm trying to say, it's okay. He was trying to say, sorry, not me. He was trying to say you are okay the way you are, even if you're schizophrenic. I mean, he was, one of his things, he was part of the anti-psychiatric movement. So
this painting is actually a abstracted portrait of a psyche.
You could argue that. I mean, after, the way it works is I have the ability to have an objective ability to see some of my best works, and those two I do consider, if 50 years from now, I'd still say they're some of my two best works. And also, in the case of Moon Lake, let's talk about that since we're... So Moon Lake was based on I took a trip with my sister and my mother, who generously took my, not that sister, another sister, around the Alps in Austria, Switzerland, northern Italy. And everything was fantastic. It was a great tour. And then we went to this place called Mondsee, and it's between Vienna and Salzburg. Okay. So we just were there for like half a day, and I noticed I got, I wasn't on anything. I got higher and higher and higher, and I thought, what is this? Is this some kind of vortex? And then said, I really remember that place, and it was Moon Lake. It's a lake. It's a resort town lake. And then I researched it. I found out all these composers that we've already mentioned went there to vacation and to get ideas and for things to happen. And also, I don't know how this happens. It's the Jungian synchronicity thing, I guess. But Klaus Schulze, who you also mentioned, did a whole album a CD, which all of you should grade. It's a masterpiece. It's called Moon Lake, and I couldn't believe it. And I said, well, that does it. I've got to do it now. So,
Well, I'm thrilled we could have that piece in the show.
But that one's a very controlled piece. It's very choreographed, everything figured out in advance. I usually don't do that, but I did it on that one.
Well, I think this would be a good time to talk about the process of making the drawings and making the paintings. The thesis for this show was to kind of illustrate the tie-ins between the drawings and the paintings. And it was fascinating talking to you about how you think of the drawings versus how you think of the paintings. And sometimes you use musical terms to describe that difference, and other times you use terms like physical terms, So I wonder if you could just tell the folks out here a little bit about how you see the relationship. Because it's not just a direct relationship like, okay, the drawings are studies for the paintings. It's more back and forth, isn't it?
No, absolutely. The obvious answer is that drawing is a direct line between the brain and the hand. It's the most direct. And no, regardless of what art form you do, whether any art form, including architecture, starts with usually a drawing. And so in the case of the reliefs, that's the most, I would say that, I said this earlier, but not here, but to somebody else, that the drawings are like one person playing a guitar without being mic'd up, and the big Moon Lake-like reliefs are like a 140-piece Bruckner orchestra. I mean, lots and lots of moving parts, 20 to 25 different steps involved with, there's something, they take a lot of planning and a lot of calculation, and the improvisation is really limited. One thing I really like to talk about, I'm glad this is great, that I talked to a mathematician one time, and he said this thing that, again, just, oh my God, what an amazing thing to say. So he said that infinity is finite, and I said, well, that's impossible. He said, no, it isn't. Let's say you have a box, and the box is the numbers 0 through 1. Well, he said this is an infinite amount of numbers between 0 and 1. Therefore, I have to work in a box, some kind of limitations. You can't just do whatever. The worst kind of client is when they say, well, do whatever you want. I don't know what you mean. I mean, you have to kind of have some kind of parameters, And I think the drawing is an opportunity to really open up to anything. I've started drawing by just throwing things at the page, and that's it, nothing until I see an image. And it's kind of the old Rorschach test, like what do I see in it, and then I keep going. We all eventually see images in any brain, human brain. You look at a cloud long enough, and that famous Joni Mitchell song, for example, Clouds, referencing her, but you eventually see something in anything, and it turns into something else.
Well, and you said that at one time the drawings might have led directly into the paintings in terms of inspiration or practicing motifs that are wind up in a painting, but I think you said that in more recent years the influence has also gone the other direction, that your drawings have become influenced by the relief paintings.
I think that's very true. I think that I'd say the influence of calculation is one of the big ones. All of a sudden, it's actually very difficult to improvise. One time, for example, I did an experiment, kind of a George Plimpton kind of experiment. I said, well, I'm going to try to do like a fake de Kooning. I'm going to do a real action painting. I'm going to do a true beatnik painting, and it was incredibly hard to do. I mean, it's really hard to be really loose. I'm sure all those artists out there who are listening know what I'm talking about, that those who are able to do that, I think the reason we like Pollock so much is that he's just extreme, 150 miles an hour with 10 beers with no seatbelt, and we like that reckless. He's kind of in the tradition of, I hate to say it, but he's part of that dangerous American tradition. Only an American can do that art. I hate to say it, but he makes me really proud to be, because it's specifically violent American-looking art. You know, it's fantastic work. You know.
I agree.
Yeah.
Do you listen to music while you are painting and carving?
I listen to music all the time. I mainly often listen to music when I'm down and I want to not be. I mean, it's sort of an antidepressant, you know. Sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, what's it like? This incredibly hyper detailed, meticulous incisions and burnings in the burning paintings. What is it like to be in the throes of creation? I mean, is it fun? Is it drudgery? I mean, what's...
Well, it's wonderful. It's sort of zen. It's when you can make something that normally other people would consider tedious, interesting, then you know you're really onto something. And I love the emotion of being in a trance, and I love the feeling of that I'm into something and I don't know where I am. And it's a terrible way to put it, but it's the same thing as losing control utterly, but you gain a different kind of control, I guess. And you're probably speaking about the reliefs. They're really slow. A lot of people say, well, how can you put up with the boredom involved with doing them? And it's a good question, but to me it's not boring, it's more ambient. That's a famous New Yorker cartoon, by the way, but it's very accurate. It says, it says, oh, my friend isn't boring, he's ambient. You know? and there is actually some good boring art. I mean, like Brian Eno, Music for Airports, arguably is boring, but it's fantastic. You know, I mean, and some minimalism, you know, is boring, but it's something else too. You know.
I think of Agnes Martin, for example.
Right.
You know, you do go into that sort of tranquil, serene, calmative zone when you look at that work.
Right.
And in your work, I just find it, so much of it, just ecstatic, just blazing forth. It was so much energy, so much hyperkineticism. And I know you have said that one of your highest goals as an artist is to make people high, to give a feeling of opiate high or psychedelia, but not through drugs, through your art alone.
Well, you know, I gotta say, a shout out to the opium poppy, because I remember I did experiment with it quite a bit between, for example, about 1999 to 2010, maybe those years, I was doing it regularly and using it as a tool for my art. But one of the reasons I was interested in it, and I know we're getting into sort of controversial territory, but
surely not.
Well, one of the things on a serious note, I was very interested in trying to do was I was trying to think, how do I get this exalted emotion? Obviously, this flower does something amazing to our brain. It's been involved with us for the last 10,000 years, man's first collagen. How do I do that visually? You're very right. So there is definitely an agenda where I'm trying to, what good does it, this is sort of where I get political. I was recently in London and I saw some work and I felt like slitting my wrists after seeing the show. All it was making me feel guilty. That's all. It was just guilt tripping. And that's what I don't want to do. I don't think that does any good. I'm sort of interested in things that unify rather than, so that's the only politics that I can think of how it would be political.
I've always found in your work, despite the darkness, there is kind of an overwhelming, overreaching optimism and beauty, and an unabashed love of beauty.
I think that's true, and again, a shout out to my mother who, pounded in Mozart, and now I'm glad she did that, because what is beyond that? Pretty much nothing that I know about. that kind of music. And that's why I have really good taste in pop music, because my foundation is in the classical, And I am a snob about music. And it's okay to be intolerant about something, right?
And opinionated, right? I want to ask you, I mentioned Shannon.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, I think that you're discovering these drawings that are up in the gallery after her death was almost in a way a kind of parting gift to you from her. And I know that you have told me that you learned some things from her. Could you tell the folks the kind of person that she was and what you did learn from her?
She was the most incredible person I've ever known. She was we just had this kind of thing that is irreplaceable. We collaborated really well. I wanted to experiment with different kinds of art forms, and she was right there helping me figure out how to line up all the different things on the page. I'm not being very articulate, but the
value.
I think that it also, she taught me. I mean, this is sort of dark and sad, but how short life is and how little time we have. I mean, she's gone now, and it's here today, gone tomorrow kind of thing. And the older you get, the more you realize that. And basically, the answer is everything. And the reason I feel like a responsibility in her memory to keep going, not to do a, whatever. But the very quickly, a reference that would help everybody. In the movie 2001, which is one of my favorite movies, Stanley Kubrick. By the way, I saw a great show in London this year of Stanley Kubrick, but they talked a lot about how the last scene in the movie was the person, sees his whole life really quickly, right? Yeah. Well, that's kind of how it kind of is, I think, when you're on your deathbed. You look back and it's, wow, that was really fast, kind of thing. So one of her gifts was that awareness. I'm really aware of how temporary this all is, so it's like I don't want to waste any time because the time is really limited, kind of thing, and more of an urgency to live. Ironically, that's an interesting thing to bring up, that her death sort of injected a life into me or something.
I agree,
Yeah.
and I've seen, your work has had a trajectory that it seemed like after her death, the work it had already been ecstatic, but it sort of blasted into hyperspace.
Well, it's really complimentary. I wouldn't know about that kind of thing.
You are a big cat lover. You love cats, and you told me that in a way, there are certain aspects of your work that are cat-like or have a feline quality, and we haven't talked about exactly what that is. I'm very intrigued. I'm looking at the work, and where's the cats?
well, I think that I was born that way. I mean, my sister back there will say we come from a big dog family, and I was the only cat lover. I've never particularly been a dog person, and I think it has something to do with. Dogs to me have always seemed like eternal 4-year-olds, or kind of like drunks in a bar, kind of, and cats have always seemed like really intellectual stoners, or, and I'd rather talk to a stoner than a drunk, I mean, I find them just incredibly fascinating, and I like the way that they don't dumb themselves down to our level, and I actually think in many respects, they're superior to us.
They do too.
Well, and they're right. But there's a lot of reasons. I'm not alone in that, by the way. There's a couple of examples. Paul Klee, if you read deeply enough, he basically had to have a cat in the room in order to do his art. He just couldn't work. He believed they transmitted cosmic energy, and I like the sound of the purr. I think there's the whiskers. What are they radiating out? And I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, we don't know a lot. We haven't really studied their intelligence, but I think in some ways they're a higher level than we are, and I think we are primates, in that category, and they're probably a higher genus, maybe. The latter probably is better, but they may be lower on the ladder, would be the biological explanation,
One thing that I have always been intrigued in your figurative and semi-abstract work is the semi-permeability between humans, human figures that we see in some of your paintings, turning into plants, turning into animals. There are a number of drawings in this show where we see bouquets of luxuriant flowers, but there are faces in them peering out rather eerily, and they're sprouting from and it just seems like a hallucination. But it also seems like a worldview that we are plants, plants are us, that the lines that we tend to draw between species and between different kinds of entities are arbitrary.
You said it better than I could, but yeah, I think that, somebody told me, a botanist said, well, do you realize redwood trees have 3 times the DNA that we do? And we said, wait a minute, what? What does that tell you right there? I mean, plants are extremely sophisticated, and again, humans are very arrogant to think that we have, unfortunately, the ability to destroy nature as we see it, and I'm definitely very concerned, as we all are, about the environment and all the scary stuff going on. And I think it affects our brain. I think when people aren't around nature enough, I think it starts really screwing with our psyche, and I think that's what's one of the causes of mental illness. But no, that's a very good observation on your part. There is that not gender bending. What's the word? Border dissolving aspect to my work. Yes. I wanted to say another thing about that, which you brought up very well. One of the influences of the carving on the new painting is that I recently did a commission for Gruba back there, and one of the things about that mural that I don't know how it happened, but it did, which is it's extremely holographic. In other words, you really get the feeling like you can walk behind and around and in front of this thing. So there's getting back to an earlier question and related to one you just asked, that's something that that is, I think that everything that happens to you, L. Ron Hubbard 101, affects what you do. I'm not a Scientologist, but he was right about that. But yeah.
Well, I know what you mean about the walk around within it, because I've seen that it's a private mural commission that Tom is mentioning, and I have seen that piece, and somehow it has it's as if you're looking at a 3D, part of it is coming out at you, and I took that as something to do with the chromaticism of the coloration, but maybe it's more than that.
Well, I think something like that is something any artist will tell you. You can't plan or micromanage really anything. If something happens like that, it happens like by itself, kind of thing. It's like an automatic writing approach. Often the best ideas are the first ideas. That's a well-known literary writing thing, and you do a really fast Jack Kerouac thing, and then you edit later, and so.
You like to talk about the beat poets, as well as the flower power hippie movement of the 60s. It seems that is something that is suffused in your sensibility. You were born in 1960, so obviously right. You're too young to have been an adult in those eras. But it does really seem that, and I know you've studied Alan Watts, you mentioned R.D. Laing, and so many of the others, Gary Snyder, right. So many of the other seminal thinkers of that era. Is this part of your sensibility that you think goes directly into your artwork?
I'd say almost for sure, because I'm from this area. My grandfather went to Willamette, and my parents met at U of O, so shout out to U of O. And so I have a lot of roots in Oregon and in Eugene. And Eugene, of course, is definitely part of the global countercultural movement. You go to Europe, everybody knows about Eugene. Mainly, I got to say, Ken Kesey is a big part of that, and the Merry Pranksters, and there's all that kind of, maybe a little Steve Prefontaine, but it's a very well-known, read any book about the counterculture, and Eugene will eventually come up. I was born in that environment. What I'm going to do about it? I mean, I remember when I Want to Hold Your Hand, I was 4 years old, was blasting all over the neighborhood. I remember growing up with the Beatles, and my birthday is the day of the first Ed Sullivan Show, February 9th, 1964, so there you go. But anyway, I remember I was too young to know the politics of what was going on, but I remember in the early 70s sort of an initial awareness of the environmental movement, and I could never understand. Now I understand, but at the time I couldn't understand why they took the president down, at that time. So
Yeah. Yeah, and the imagery, I think, has some of the, Carnaby Street, Fellini-esque energy, in your work.
Yeah, I think
Haight-Ashbury, Carnaby Street, that kind of chromatic jubilance.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the aesthetics of all that stuff. However, when you read about, like, when George Harrison went to Haight-Ashbury, I think in 1966, he reported they're just a bunch of drugged out bums. So I realized that people that lived through the 60s have a different report than me, who sort of saw it from a distance in an idealistic magical mystery tour approach. I mean, I think the Beatles their genius was making the world like how the world could be, a utopian view of the world, and that squares very much with what I do. Whereas other people, for example, the Velvet Underground or Warhol's disaster series, are more like how it is, Yeah. And I greatly admire Warhol's 60s work.
In the early 80s, you were in New York. You were studying at Pratt at the time, and you sort of rubbed shoulders with some of the figures of the East Village art scene. You mentioned Warhol, Basquiat, Keith Haring, and so a lot of people, can see a sort of neo-expressionist influence in your work in some of the faces pieces that we see. There's drawings, and there's very kind of dark, eerie, neo-expressionist quality to those works. But we also see elements. I can see part of the jigsaw puzzle-like chunks that we would think of in a Keith Haring. But I think it's interesting that you do not really subscribe to an influence of that scene so much as you look back to people like late Claude Monet. And so I'm so interested in that. Could you tell us why Monet is such a guiding light for your work?
Thank you for asking that. I was hoping you would. I didn't have an agenda, or I didn't read a book where the book would say how great Monet is. I firsthand experienced Monet in Paris, and I suddenly, this sort of lightning bolt went off that this guy is certainly in my opinion, the greatest artist of the 19th century, and perhaps arguably the greatest artist of the 20th century. And I want to give a few reasons why. Monet he eliminated the horizon line. So he did paintings in around 1900 where it was only the water, not just the water, but the landscape down on the water, which was a radical idea. He did serialism. He did series of the haystacks, of this, I mean, you could say Constable kind of did that with his clouds, but no, Monet did the exact same composition, 25 times, slightly different kinds of light. So he, I think, was the first abstract expressionist. So, I mean, you look at Joan Mitchell's paintings in particular, they almost look like late 1920s Monet paintings. A further reason is his sense of color is beyond. I've never experienced color like that. I don't know why it's not talked about more. His sense of color is incredible. He's one of the only artists that doesn't deal at all. He also eliminated value, so it's only color relationships, temperature relationships, minute shifts in color. So, I mean, you could almost go to the point where he's like minimal, or, you know, or the Steve Reich kind of, or Terry Riley kind of, certainly Brian Eno art. There's one last thing that's really important about Monet, and there's, when you look at Van Gogh or Gauguin or all that same time period, you're aware immediately, well, this is Van Gogh's view of something. Whereas Monet, you get the sense of neutrality. Like, this is what it's like. Very few writers can do that, and not many artists can do that, where Bruce Chatwin can do that. He goes to Patagonia and he writes about Patagonia, not his version of Patagonia, but actually Patagonia, and he's a great travel writer. But Monet has that ability at his best to have the objectivity, the neutrality, and in that weird way, he's to me, a big influence on Gerhard Richter, who's one of my favorite new living artists.
Yeah, I like him a lot too.
Yeah.
And I think we find in Monet, especially the water lilies, there's a feeling of suspension or of floating that I also get from your work as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there is that, and one person said about him, he's only an eye, but oh, what an eye! You know, I mean, it's a great. You know,
Yeah.
There's a kind of. And the other thing is, it's okay to be shallow. You could almost argue, well, his work's sort of shallow. Well, so what? You know, I mean, it's you know.
Well, isn't there a quote from Oscar Wilde to that effect?
Well, Oscar Wilde said a lot of great things, but I think one of his great, it's related to this, but he said, and I tend to agree, seriousness is the highest refuge of the shallow. In other words, you know, like, he was really anti-pomposity and that's related.
Yeah,
you know, I
yeah.
guess. You know.
Well, as we move towards the question and answer period, I wanted to ask you a sort of an overarching question. This exhibition, which I think just turned out so amazing, and by the way, we are still actively looking to travel this show or reconstitute this show at other venues around the state and the nation so that more people in other regions can see your incredible work. And I hope that happens.
Me too.
Yeah.
I love that.
But looking back over 45 years, back to when you were 14, to walk through this exhibition and see your work across that time span and across these various media, what is that like for you?
Mostly as if someone else did it. You know, that was my first impression. I don't know what that means, but I don't understand. Sort of, there's a feeling of disassociation, and some of it appreciation. You know, in other words, if I didn't do it, I'd still like it. You know.
That's a good. Yeah, I'd be worried if that weren't the case.
Yeah, right. But you know, I got to say that I do see. I don't want to bring it up too much because we're not going to go negative. I don't want to bum anybody out. But I have seen lots of shows. I want to bring that up again. That what I'm sort of against and not my thing is being political, or political in the sense of dragging people down and being made to feel guilty about something they're not guilty of, you know, for example.
Well, I do find in your work, even in, you know, some of those earlier works that are more dark, a sense of questioning, of an appreciation of mystery, but also in the later. Go ahead.
You're absolutely right. I wanted to bring up one more weird thing I just thought of. It just triggered me what you just said. After I came back from New York, I was highly stimulated from that experience, and Portland was really slow and not very interesting at first. And then I got invited to a party, and all these guys at the party were from a place called the Oregon School of Design, and they were incredibly interesting. And I've never talked about that influence before, but I only was friends with architects for about 2 years, and they were really fun, and they sort of taught me collaboration and lightening up, don't worry about anything, try new stuff. And I think indirectly that was a huge segue into the carving, because I think it was like the Bauhaus. I mean, and I met some of the teachers just sort of at beer things I remember there was a place called Bogart's Joint, if any, Old Portland, and they'd often have classes run late at Bogart's Joint, and there was it was just a very advanced, ahead of its time place in Portland, like international architects lecturing. And I remember meeting Rob and Leon Carrier, for example, and that really affected me, So architecture
In terms of, and the Bauhaus in terms of perfectionism and craftsmanship underlying the artistry.
I think just a rigor, a seriousness in the best sense, super smart people everywhere. So ideas were just everywhere. Parties that went till 4 a.m. with live jazz bands and, tons of alcohol. And some of these people are now famous, like Richard Jensen's a really famous architect, and I, partied with him back in the 80s. And, Rob Lamb, all these different people that were really fun, and Clark Llewellyn, I remember that name, Al Edelman, and gotta say, I remember, I never met you back then, but I remember John was somehow connected with it, because people... Yeah, because, I gotta say, people talked highly of John, but I never met him at that time, There you go, yeah. I mean, he's major, too. And it's a tragedy. I don't know what happened, but I think Clark ran off with the money, or I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened. I was just, and another big influence was Louis Lopez, and that started it was sort of, there was a movement there called Les Animaux. I remember those guys. And so anything you want to do, just go do it.
The animals.
The animals. Uh-huh. And so it was a DIY before there was DIY is what it was. And I think those guys really influenced me.
Cool. I'm glad we could touch on that.
Yeah, I am too.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
They had, they just start a party in the North Park blocks until the cops showed up. They were really anti-authoritarian, I will say,
That's definitely the old Portland.
Yeah.
Well, Tom, we've been talking for about an hour, and I thought this might be a good time, Danielle, if it's good by you, to open the floor to some questions from the audience.
Let's see if this is working.
Bring it on.
So if you have a question, we'll ask you, if you raise your hand, I'll bring you the mic. We'll ask you to speak into the mic so we can capture it on our video and so that everybody can hear clearly. And I know we want to leave enough time for signing, too, so maybe 3 or 4 questions. And then we'll wrap up so that we can do some book signing together.
Great.
So if anyone have a question for Richard or
This is
Tom?
the Phil Donahue section of the... I did want to say, by the way, that I did not get paid any endorsement fee for drinking this Coca-Cola. This was...
Right, we'll see if we can get something out of them.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Actually, first a comment. You maybe heard the saying, dogs have owners, cats have staff.
Right.
Right, well, that's us.
Yeah.
I have a question, though, and that is that your work has always been very, very full. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of pieces in it, it doesn't have empty places in it. It's especially the carved pieces, but also we see it in the drawings. The faces are different. That's a different kind of thing. But for the other pieces that are so jam-packed and really all over, too, a la Pollock, can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, yes, I would love to talk about that. I think Monet he's all over, too. He may have breaks in where the lilies are, but he's definitely all over, and there's no... and Pollock is like that. He's all over. So it probably boils down, it may boil down to like personal taste, and it's also probably on the dark side, maybe an insecurity, a fear of open spaces. It's very interesting you ask that, because I very much dislike deserts. And I really like Western Oregon, big trees, the redwoods and the gorge and the coast. And the coast, somehow it's not like the desert, but I'm polytheistic, basically. Monotheism doesn't work for me. That's a desert religion. I'm not a desert person. So I can see the God in everything, pantheism.
Pagan sort of appreciation of the tree, the stream,
Right.
the
I
rock.
like things that are filled up. I like maximalism. Probably, a friend of mine a long time ago said, "Well, you're a maximalist," and I said, "Okay," but
I like
I like, Mark Tobey. He's a very well-known North Seattle-based. He filled up a lot. So I think one of the reasons is just probably personal taste.
And I like the tie-in with the land, with the
Yeah.
I know you love to hike in the gorge, and you're very much an outdoors person. So the density of the old-growth forests maybe is in the same part of your mind.
I like the emotion of getting really messed up or screwed up, like this recent mural thing, like really not doing very well. And then I used to like alcohol for this reason, for one reason only. It's a terrible thing to say, but I loved recovering. I like the process of sort of getting better, and yeah, it's sort of. I think it's the same concept. It brings up amazing points, but it's the same reason why some people that are hyperactive are actually calmed by drugs that make them more hyperactive, like Ritalin, for example, makes people calm. Well, that squares on a scientific level with the question.
Yeah, I think the hyperdensity of your compositions up close are very, very jittery and maybe nervous making. But when you go back and you look at the piece from afar, there is a serenity to it.
Yeah, God, I just thought of another thing. That was such a good question. It opens up everything. But one thing that Alan Watts talked about, which I think is really apropos, if you take a giant boulder, it's one thing, and if you break that boulder until it's sand, well, it's still one thing, but it's in little pieces. So I try to unify through breaking it up, I guess, would be that's my way of unifying something,
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you. I'm curious, Tom, do you use in all your different works, is there a symbol or a message that you include in all your pieces that only maybe you know about, you don't want to tell us about? Or is there any consistency in kind of anything subliminal in is there a message? Do you put something special in each one of your...
I think
curious.
Subconsciously I probably do, because I've had the experience where some of the all over very complicated pieces, at the time I didn't consciously put an image in there, but later I realize and recognize that there are images that emerge. So the answer would be yes, but on a subconscious level, not on a conscious level. If it's conscious, you would see it immediately. But in terms of embedded imagery, I am fascinated with that idea. The surrealists were obviously very good at that. The obvious example is, the most obvious is Dalí, who did, like rock formations that turned into a face. That's an obvious example of what, an embedded image. They were in André Masson, and actually pre-Drip Pollock had a lot of embedded imagery. He was a very different artist before he got into the dripping.
There's a great piece of yours that initially when I saw it, I read it as an abstract piece. And then, as I was looking at these sort of little mosaics I realized it was a picture. It was a visage of Ludwig von Beethoven.
Right.
Yeah, it's a classic piece of yours.
By the way, that is a collaboration with Shannon Kraft. And I won't get rid of that. I mean, I won't sell it. It's a one-off. I in fact did do a bunch of pieces where it was called Oregon Monuments. Do you remember that
It was
show?
a Laura Russo.
It was, yeah. And that entire show was like that. You could kind of, after 5 minutes, oh, well, that's the Tillamook Lighthouse. After 5 minutes, oh, that's Timberline Lodge. But it was pretty embedded, but I did a lot of the work for the viewer. That's always been my thing, is I prefer more embedded, i.e. abstract, non-objective art categorically, because I like art that makes the viewer work a little bit. I don't care much for one-liner art. Not to the current show at our art museum, it's just one-liner art. It's telling you how to see and what to think, and that doesn't interest me. There are people that's fine if they like that kind of thing. I'm just like, you can't like everything, you know. I really prefer, in terms of text, very quickly, I really like somebody like Ed Ruscha, because he's wonderfully vague and wonderfully poetic, and kind of makes you think about Los Angeles rather than telling you how to think. And I like writing that doesn't tell you how to think about something. You know.
I saw another hand. Yes.
I liked how you talked about how you liked music as art. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, of course. Great question. I think that music is the highest art form, meaning it's the most immediate. And one music critic, said the most amazing thing, which is, music is always tragic because you know it's always going to end. Therefore, it's tragic. So, shout out for that idea. But I think, again, how we opened up, we talked a lot about synesthesia, you know, hearing music and seeing images and hearing music. On a direct level, I did a set for the Oregon Ballet Theater, which involved me doing the sets, and then the music was the Future Sound of London, and the choreography was James Canfield out of New York, so it was this huge, you know, three-way thing, and that was just a blast. And again, I think that architectural thing after New York made me had an ability to start collaborating, and I like to collaborate, you know.
Any other questions? Come on, I'm sure we got at least one more.
I can just maybe do it without it, which is you referenced the mural that you've been working on, and I wonder if you could talk to people here about what they would see if they went to Portland.
The recent one, you mean? Yeah, well, that mural was a response to a mural was there for about 28 years, and it was torn down in 2017, and there was, it was called Machine, and that was a very, I think it was a great piece, but it reflected the time in which it was done, which was the late 80s. It had a very 80s, you know, XTC, popish feeling, Peter Max, so forth. I don't know why. You can laugh all you want. It's okay. But anyway, it was torn down, and there was sort of a legal thing involved. I was approached by this guy that wanted to, like, you know, do this huge lawsuit, and I got kind of afraid. And so my regular guy who's here told me just settle with these guys. You're going to get killed. You know? I mean, they're going to blow your windows out. And that was just too much power. I just couldn't take them on, and I'm not, you know, just. I was burned out. So I settled with these guys, and we settled on a new mural in the same place, and I got creative control over it. But I also wanted, again, my collaborative thing. I respect the architect, so I worked with the architect with what, you know, some of his ideas, and, you know.
And it's beautiful.
Thank you.
And then if anybody goes to Bend, you've got a wonderful mural there. Where and what is it in a park?
That, thank you I forgot about that mural. That was,
I saw the pictures. I haven't actually been there,
Yeah.
but it looks really fabulous.
Thanks, yeah.
Where is it?
yeah, it was, I got a call from, I'd never heard of these people before, and they said, we got your name from Chris Monlux, who's Monkey Productions, a rock promoter, and we're tired of the boring mural, and we want a little life affirming, and we got your name, and can you do it? And I said, well, what, blah, blah. And it's a long story short, I did, and I said, only if you get me for that number, only if you get me like 20 people to help. So I had like 20 of these guys, I was just like a Werner Herzog bossing these people around. I didn't really do that much.
You didn't have to lift any.
I just was in the the left bossing people around, and I'm sure they thought, who is this a-hole from? But anyway, I got it done. I did the lines and so forth. But
well, you mentioned Monkey Productions. Of course, the Wonder Ballroom in Portland, if you've been in it, is the foyer is an extraordinary, immersive experience of Tom's work, and it's just dazzling.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. That was a really tough, challenging commission, because the guy that commissioned it, Chris Monleck, said, well, we have Nike employee meetings in here, and then we have punk rock shows, and you have to do something that no one will hate or everybody will like. So, so I had to figure out how to do something that, a really wide range of people looking at it. And it's worked, and I think one of the reasons it works is it doesn't have any bright colors. It's just, he decided that, and it was a good choice. He has a good, yeah.
Silvery,
right,
and sort of
so it's
mauve, periwinkle.
And it's very embedded with imageries, by the way. And yeah, that's helped me out a lot. A lot of people have seen that, and I've gotten other work from that. So
cool. It's a beautiful piece.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Maybe
I know we
one
have
last
to.
question.
Okay.
Tom,
yes.
The origin of the mobile Kramer mobiles, were they commissioned Volkswagens, Suburbans?
Oh, the car thing. God, I forgot about that. Yeah.
Were those early on? There was an ER dock in Seaside, a guy named Tom, who drove a Suburban with your artwork all over it.
Yeah, most people, maybe they do, maybe that you mentioned in your essay, right?
Yeah.
I had a business for a while, literally, to support myself. I painted cars, and it started out only by accident. I painted my own Vespa. People liked it, and then, will you do this? Will you do that? So I kept doing it for other people, and then I would buy old Volkswagens. Back in the day, they were, $200 for an old Bug. Have a hippie mechanic fix it up and sell it for, $900, and start, I had a pretty good thing going. So it was just, and that's what led to the murals, Yeah, it did, because the machine thing happened because this lady comes up to me and says, wow, could you do that on a wall? And I said, well, I guess so. So it was amazing how little I was paid for that machine mural. It took 3 weeks, 8 hours a day, 7 days a week. I think I got $500, so. Wow. Great pay, Sure, yeah.
I know you from back when you were a teenager being kind of like obnoxiously asking questions all the time with my artist friends in Cannon Beach. And some of them were some pretty wild ceramic artists.
Right.
Some have become nationally famous
Right.
as well, like Brian Ransom.
Right.
And he was into music, and I don't know if that was happening back then.
I got to give a shout out. This is Mike Stanley. He had the Irish Bike Shop in Cannon Beach, and during the summer of 1977, I was 17. I rode my bike down there, and I had one of the most amazing experiences of my entire life, even to this day. And part of it was Mike was so nice to me and welcoming, and we built this big sweat lodge and all these, I was 17 after all, and still, very naive, and all these naked ladies everywhere, and beer, and, it was so much. I mean,
I should have put that in the book.
Yeah, well, and then there, I got to give a shout out to Evelyn Georges, who had the wonderful White Bird Gallery. She was a great hero of mine. People have a hard time believing this, but it was a really, really first-class, world-class gallery. I mean, all the greats showed there. George Johann, Hank Pander, blah, blah, blah. So I got exposed to a lot of good art at a young age, and no better place to look at it when the nice salt air and Joe Police. You remember So I have a hardwired love of the old Cannon Beach, you know.
I should mention too that one of the art cards that you did is a picture of it in the book, in the catalog for the show that we're going to be signing here momentarily, and that car is in front of the machine mural that we were just talking about. So it's 2 for 1.
And that photograph was taken by Shannon Kraft.
3 for 1.
3 for 1.
There we go. Well,
And there is, I'm sorry that Roger over here didn't ask me about Clifford Gleason, but we didn't get into other people but it's all right. It's all right. There was some other stuff we didn't get into. We can't get into everything, but I wanted to say at Halley Ford next year, when is it going to open? One of my favorite artists is having a show up there.
Clifford Gleason, when does that open?
Yeah. Yeah, it'll be great. Yeah.
and we couldn't get to everything, of course, with a mind
No.
as eclectic as yours. But I think we did cover a lot of ground.
No, we did. It
And
was
I
great.
really appreciate your responses, which were delightful, as
Well,
always.
you too. You were incredible to work
We're a
with.
mutual admiration society, aren't we? Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for your questions and for coming.